So, how do we control pests and what we call weeds? Pests and weeds are just names of organisms that we decide are not beneficial for ourselves, essentially. Um, Weeds can be, edible. They could be have many benefits in certain ways, but if it's not particularly benefiting yourself, we often call it a weed. And so we have created these chemicals to help control these or kill these pests or weeds, and we call them pesticides or herbicides. The pesticides are synthetic, meaning that we have to create them ourselves, that kill insects, plants, or fungi, fungicides. Um, a huge amount of these pesticides are being used every single year. Pesticides will definitely increase food production. You're helping to protect the plants from being eaten by other things so you can eat it. But it can have some adverse health effects. For example, farm workers have really high exposure levels still. Consumers ingest some pesticide residues, so we need to make sure that we wash our particularly our non-organic produce. Theoretically, if we have organic, it should not have pesticides. Pesticides also kill non-target organisms. So these are more general pesticides, including predators and parasites of pests and pollinators, which again can exacerbate the problem of pests. Roundup, for example, has reduced milkweed, which is a staple for monarch butterfly populations, and as a result has caused the monarch population to plummet. So a new kind of insecticide has been designed today. Um, the neonicotinoids are the particular class of drugs that make a particular plant toxic to insects. Um, but they can also harm bees that pollinate that particular plant too. And these drugs will enter the soil and water as a result and can potentially kill other organisms. The other thing is that we have what's called the pesticide treadmill that happens. And pests can evolve resistance to these pesticides. We spray pesticide, it kills a mass majority of the pests if it's designed correctly. But that doesn't mean it's 100%. Most likely the organisms have some variation in their DNA that a few of them might be able to resist that particular pesticide. And what happens is those individuals then reproduce and pass on that resistance to their offspring. And so now we have to find a new pesticide. And so what we call this a pesticide treadmill, where we constantly have to redesign and apply new pesticides and new pesticides. So what do we do, right? How do we get off of this pesticide treadmill and try something new? Well, we have what's called alternatives like biological control, where we use natural predators and parasites to introduce and eliminate these pests. In the 1920s, we had the cactus moth, and it was successfully introduced into Australia to control invasive prickly pear cactus. Prickly pear cactus is now all over the Southwest. You can get prickly pear cactus jelly and jam. It's actually very tasty, but it is an invasive species. A very modern or new concept is something called BT, or Bacillus thuringiensis soil bacterium. And these particular bacteria produce a protein that can kill caterpillars and fly and beetle larvae. Um, these can be sprayed eventually on plants. And what they've done now is take this particular gene that produces that particular protein, and they've genetically engineered crops allowing them to produce the particular poison without having to be sprayed with BT. Um, and so that is one way in which we are genetically modifying crops to not have to use pesticides if they're genetically producing those chemicals or toxins themselves. Um, and sometimes when we incorporate a biocontrol agent, we have to be really careful. Sometimes they themselves can be pests. Um, you have to be really careful. This is kind of risky, particularly if you're putting a non-native predator into a new environment. We have classic examples of this with the cane toad in Australia, which was a type of toad that was growing in Hawaii, was brought over to take and eat the grubs that were eating crops. And they didn't eventually eat the grubs, but they ate everything else, and they multiplied very quickly in this new environment. So they themselves became a problem. Also, cactus moths employed in Australia to fight prickly pear cactus, but it eventually spread to the United States. As we said, prickly pear is now in the Southwest. So integrated pest management is kind of the new frontier, which you combine sort of biochemical and chemical methods, where you have chemical pesticides, biocontrol, habitat alteration, crop rotation, transgenic crops like BT, corns and wheats, alternative tillage methods, and mechanical pest removal. This has been extremely effective in a lot of places like Indonesia, where they've increased their rice production and cut their pesticides. So it's actually helping to reduce price or cost as well. You can see in here the pesticide reduction, pesticide subsidy, and production has gone up slightly. And there we are.